They called it nonsense, those strange marks carved into torn pages of a Bible with no words. But on the night the barn burned down when the dogs wouldn't stop barking and the patrols were chasing shadows through the fields, every single mark suddenly mattered. Nella was already gone by then, barefoot in the rain, carrying nothing but memory and dust. And somewhere not far behind her, a baby was crying quietly under a floorboard, while three people waited in the dark, praying she had remembered the path. She hadn't spoken in years, but the marks had spoken for her, because the Bible didn't need words. It needed someone brave enough to read it in silence. They dragged her out just after sunrise when the dew still clung to the grass and the mist hadn't yet lifted from the fields. Naila's wrists were tied in front of her, but she didn't resist. Her feet, bare and calloused from years of labor, moved quietly over the cold earth. Around her, the plantation had begun to stir, cows moaning for milk shovels clanking in the distance, the usual songs of the broken. But today there was no rhythm, only silence and the heavy breath of fear. At the center of the yard stood Master Carrington, arms crossed, eyes burning. In one hand he held a worn, tattered book with no title. In the other, a whip. This, he snarled, lifting the book high, was found under her bedroll. A Bible, or what's left of one. The overseer chuckled. A Bible with no words. Blank pages. Witchcraft, if you ask me. The slaves gathered nearby lowered their heads. No one dared speak. Naella stood alone, her eyes meeting the master's with a strange calm. Her face was scratched from a night's work in the cotton fields. Her dress hung loose on her frame, more gray than white now, but she held herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to survive in silence. Carrington stepped closer. "What are you trying to do, girl? Stir hope into these fools with invisible ink? You think I don't know what this means?" He flipped the pages violently, dozens of them brittle and yellowed with faint carvings. No one else seemed to understand. Circles, lines, half-moons, symbols that looked more like scratches than script. To him they were nonsense. To her they were everything. Nella didn't speak. She hadn't since the night they took her mother away. Silence had become her shield, her prayer, her language. But she held the master's gaze steady as stone until his lip curled with disgust. He tossed the book onto the ground. "Burn it." The overseer took a torch from the stable boy and walked toward the pile of kindling. But before he could act, an old woman's voice broke the air. "Wait." Heads turned. It was Marnie, the oldest slave on the property, her back bent with age, but her voice sharp as ever. She shuffled forward, hands trembling slightly as she pointed to the book. "That's Adeline's." Carrington raised a brow. "Who, her mother?" "Adeline. She was here long before you ever inherited this place. That book was hers." Nella's eyes widened. She had never heard anyone speak her mother's name out loud on the plantation. It was like hearing a ghost speak through the living. "Burn it anyway," Carrington said. "Old ghosts don't scare me." But something in Marnie's face gave him pause. Maybe it was the way her eyes narrowed, or the hint of a smile that crossed her lips. In any case, he waved off the overseer. "Put her back in the storage shed, and keep that book locked away. I'll deal with her later." Naella was dragged back, the coarse rope biting into her wrists. But even in pain, something inside her had shifted. Marnie's words had opened a door she thought long closed. That night, while the others slept, she lay curled in the straw, replaying the symbols in her mind, like a song she'd forgotten, but still somehow remembered. Her fingers traced lines in the dust. A circle, a cross, 3 dots in a row. The carvings had meanings, not letters, directions. Her mother hadn't left her a prayer book. She'd left her a map. Naella blinked back tears, not of fear but of clarity, of recognition. She wasn't just a woman carrying a relic from the past. She was the keeper of a code written by hands that dared to dream of escape. A Bible without words, yes, but rich with truth for those who knew how to listen. And tomorrow night, someone would come knocking, just like her mother had once whispered in her dreams. And when that knock came, she would be ready. She would be more than a slave. She would be the path. She didn't sleep that night. Not really. The bruises on her back burned with every breath, but Naella stayed awake, eyes fixed on the wooden ceiling above the storage shed. The stars were hidden behind thick clouds, but in her mind she was tracing every symbol from that book, every curve, every scratch, every line her mother had ever carved into those fragile pages. They had taken the book, but they hadn't taken what mattered. By morning, her fingers were dusty from drawing invisible shapes in the dirt floor. Over and over again, circles, arrows, waves. Her hands moved like they remembered, even when her body was weak. When the door creaked open and a bucket of water was shoved inside, she barely flinched. The guard said nothing, just left her there like something to be forgotten. But not everyone had forgotten. Late that afternoon, while the sun baked the earth and the air hung still, the old woman Marnie appeared outside the slats of the shed. She didn't come close, just stood by the wall like someone visiting a grave. "I knew your mother," she said softly, barely louder than the wind. "They think she died a fool. But I remember, she wasn't hiding a Bible. She was hiding a way out." Nayla's breath caught. "She carved it for years," Marnie went on. "Didn't let no one see. Not even me at first. Said words could be stolen, but pictures stay with you." There was silence for a moment, then the old woman shuffled something under the door, a strip of old linen torn at the edges. Nayla picked it up with shaking hands. Carved into the cloth in the same clean lines she had memorized since childhood were 15 symbols, the same ones her mother had etched into the pages. Marnie had copied them. Not all, but enough. "They burned the book, child," Marnie said. "But not your memory. That's still yours." And just like that, she was gone. That night when the stars came out again, Nayla was no longer alone. They came to her one by one while the others slept, moving like shadows through the cane fields. Caleb, the quiet man who had lost a son last winter. Ruth, her belly heavy with child eyes swollen from days without sleep. And young Isaiah, barely more than a boy, but with a fire in him no whip could beat out. They had heard the stories. Not the loud ones, but the whispered kind that lived in corners. Of maps carved into silence. Of a woman who disappeared one night without a sound and was never seen again, but whose Bible had kept traveling from hand to hand. They came not to beg, but to follow. "We heard you knew the way," Caleb said, crouching beside her in the dark. "Not the road, the real way." Nayla didn't answer with words. She took the linen from beneath her dress, spread it across the ground, and began to trace the symbols again, this time for all of them to see. Her fingers moved slowly, carefully. Each mark was a sentence, each line a direction. They didn't ask how she knew. They only listened. Ruth touched one of the marks. "Is this the river crossing?" Nayla nodded once. They sat together for hours, planning by moonlight, sketching the land with charcoal on stone, marking where the dogs were kept, where the fences were weakest, where the old tobacco barn had a hidden crawl space no longer used. Everything mattered. Every footstep, every hour of the night. And for the first time in years, Nayla spoke. "Tomorrow night," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, dry with disuse, but it held the strength of someone who'd buried fear long ago. "We leave tomorrow." Isaiah blinked. With no map, she looked him in the eye. "The map's in here," she said, tapping her temple. "My mama put it there." He didn't question her again. As they faded back into the shadows one by one, Nayla sat alone once more, hands folded in her lap, the linen resting against her chest. Above her, the wind whispered through the cane like a hymn. She had no Bible. She had no weapon. But she had something even the master couldn't burn. She had memory, and she had people willing to walk through fire with her. And when the fire came, it wouldn't find them waiting. It would find them gone. The rain came just before dusk, soft at first, brushing the cane fields like breath, then harder until it soaked the earth and turned every dirt path into mud. It was the kind of storm that made the dogs restless, and the guards retreat to their porches, grumbling about wet boots and the smell of wet tobacco. For Nayla, it was a blessing disguised as thunder. The rain would hide their footprints, muffle their movement, and turn darkness into sanctuary. She waited until the last lamp had dimmed and the final whistle of the overseer's flask echoed down the corridor of slave cabins. Then, with the linen tucked close to her skin and her heart pounding like hooves on wet ground, she stepped out of the shed. Caleb was already waiting by the edge of the fence, a shovel slung across his back, not for digging but for defense. Isaiah crouched near the base of the pecan tree, eyes darting, body humming like a taut wire. Ruth came last, moving slower than the rest, one hand braced on her belly, the other gripping a bundle of cloth tied to her chest. Inside it, a small baby's cry stirred but did not rise. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Everything had been decided last night under the moon, and between the lines of a map only Naela could truly see. They passed the tobacco barn, where the dogs were chained, careful to stay downwind. They slipped through the split fence behind the tool shed, ducking low beneath the oak branches. The sky flashed once, brief white violent, then left them in blackness so thick it felt like smoke. Naela moved first, her steps unhurried, her hand brushing the base of each tree, the back of each signpost, as if reading braille from the forest itself. The linen with the symbols remained hidden now. It had done its job. What she carried in her mind was no longer a series of shapes. It was a path laid out in instinct memory, and the way her mother used to hum when she carved each mark into the paper. One note for north, two hums for water, a pause before the bend. Half a mile and the first problem came. A patrol cart unexpected creaked down the ridge trail ahead, its lanterns swinging from a rusted hook, casting just enough light to catch movement. The four of them dropped flat into the grass, hearts hammering like war drums, holding breaths so tight it felt like dying. The cart passed, creaking, slow and deliberate, a shadow inside the lantern glow, shifting like a man scratching his beard. Then silence. Then the wind. They waited 5 full minutes before moving again. When Ruth stumbled, her knees sinking into the mud, it was Isaiah who helped her up, her arm draped over his shoulder, like she weighed nothing at all. Naela stopped long enough to place a palm on Ruth's cheek. There was sweat there, not from heat but from pain. Too soon, Naela thought. The baby is too close. We have to keep going, she whispered, voice tight, urgent, but still calm. Another mile and there's a crawl space under the old Cooper barn. You can rest there. The group pressed on, crossing a shallow stream where water reached their knees. The current tugged at their legs fast and cold, but they held to one another, moving as one. When they reached the far side, Isaiah pointed up the hill. There, he said. That's it. The barn was a skeleton of what it once was, half collapsed, thick with vines, the roof sagging. But beneath the floorboards, beneath a false stack of crates, there was a hollow space just large enough for 4 people to hide. They climbed in one by one, soaked, shaking, filthy with mud and fear. Inside the darkness, Ruth let out a quiet gasp, curling forward, her hands gripping her knees. Caleb lit a tiny oil lamp and shaded the flame with his hands. She's starting, he said grimly. It's too early. Naela didn't answer. She knelt beside Ruth, pressing her palm against the damp fabric of her dress, feeling the tightness, the rhythm of a body preparing to split itself open. They had no blankets, no clean water, no midwife, and outside the rain had stopped, which meant sound traveled again. Naela took a deep breath, looked at the others, then whispered with calm certainty, "We won't stay long. We'll rest just enough for her to breathe, and then we move. There's still a safe house 2 miles north near the creek bend. If we make it before dawn, we'll be invisible by morning." And though no one said it aloud, they all knew what it meant. If Ruth couldn't move, someone would have to stay behind. Naela did not flinch. She had made peace with that possibility long before the rain began. The hours that followed were thick with silence, the kind that made even breath feel like a betrayal. Beneath the sagging floorboards of the Cooper barn, the 4 of them huddled together, limbs folded, clothes soaked, nerves frayed thin. Ruth whimpered now and then, a low rhythmic sound she tried to swallow, but it leaked out of her, despite herself. Her contractions came closer, harder, like waves beating against a fragile shoreline. She gritted her teeth, nails digging into the packed dirt, trying not to scream. Nella sat beside her, one hand on Ruth's back, the other pressed against the woman's belly, feeling the force building beneath skin and bone. It was too soon, too fast. They were out of time. "We can't move her," Caleb said, finally, voice no louder than a breath. He sat near the lamp eyes, scanning the barn's walls as if they might close in at any second. "She won't make it 2 more miles. Neither will the baby." Naela didn't answer. She was watching the dust drift beneath the floorboards. It was rising slightly with every gust of wind, gusts that came faster now, too fast to be natural. A change in air pressure, movement, hooves. They were being followed. She rose to her feet, steady but slow, wiping the mud from her palms onto the side of her dress. Her eyes met Caleb's, then Isaiah's. Nothing needed to be said. They all knew what it meant. The patrol had found the trail again. Isaiah moved toward the crawl space entrance, peering through the slats in the wall. 2 riders, he whispered. Maybe more behind. Nala stepped forward, reaching into her dress and pulling out the last of the linen damp frayed, but still intact. She handed it to Caleb. "You take it," she said. "Keep going. Follow the creek until it forks, then head west until you see the broken willow. That's the signal tree. There'll be someone waiting near the ridge." Caleb looked at her confusion, quickly turning to horror. "You're not coming," she shook her head. "They need a sound, a body, a shadow running east." "You can't," he began but stopped when he saw her expression. It wasn't fear in her eyes, it was resolve. Something colder, older. "I know this land better than they do," she said. "I'll lead them the wrong way. I'll give you time." But what if Isaiah whispered? Nayela smiled, and it was the kind of smile that hurt to look at, quiet, knowing threaded with grief and purpose. "Don't worry about what if. Just make it matter." She knelt beside Ruth one last time, brushing the damp hair from her forehead, her voice soft but steady. "You hold on. Don't let go until you hear birds. Not wolves, not dogs. Birds. That means you made it." Then she stood, ducked out of the crawl space, and vanished into the trees. Outside, the night was clearer than it had been in days. The moon high and pale threw long silver shadows across the soaked earth. Niella moved like she belonged there, feet silent against the leaves, hands parting branches like water. She let the riders hear her, just enough, a snapped twig here, a flash of white fabric there, a ghost trail just real enough to follow. And they did. She could hear them behind her, now shouts, curses, the pounding of hooves drawing closer. She didn't run in a straight line. She zigzagged, looped back, crossed a stream twice to throw them off. She left pieces of herself behind with every step. The tip of her scarf caught on a bramble, a smear of mud shaped like a footprint, a stone overturned to point the wrong direction. Each misdirection bought another minute, and each minute was a prayer. Eventually, when her legs screamed and her lungs burned, she reached the ravine, the one that dropped, suddenly hidden by thickets until it was too late. She stood at its edge, panting, every muscle trembling. Behind her, the riders were still coming. She turned and faced the trees. The first one burst through, eyes wild, rifle raised. He opened his mouth to shout but froze. She didn't run. She didn't plead. She simply stood there like a statue carved from earth and rain and stared into his face with a calm that cracked something in his chest. She raised her hands, and then she stepped back into the dark. Not in fear, in faith. The fall wasn't far, but it was enough. When the riders reached the edge, she was gone. Back in the barn, Caleb held Ruth's hand while the baby finally took his first breath. No cries, just breath. Soft. Alive. And above them, morning birds began to sing. The songbirds began their chorus before the sky had even softened from black to blue, delicate and uncertain, like they were still unsure it was safe to sing. Caleb heard them first. He'd been awake all night, crouched beside Ruth, his hand wrapped tightly around hers, refusing to let her slip into whatever quiet place she kept retreating to between contractions. Isaiah sat against the wall, his shirt soaked with sweat and blood not his own, and his face pale in the dim light. The baby, swaddled in torn cloth and pressed to Ruth's chest, was silent too, but breathing. That was enough. They didn't speak of Niella. Not yet. No one dared ask if she had survived the fall or if the riders had circled back after finding nothing but broken branches and footprints that led nowhere. Hope in that hour was too fragile to name. All they knew was that they were still alive and that Nayla had given them that gift at a cost she never asked them to repay. As dawn began to stretch itself across the treetops, Caleb made the decision. They couldn't stay in the barn. Ruth could barely walk, and the child, though the small, seemed strong enough to travel, but only if they moved slowly and carefully. The danger hadn't passed, only shifted. The patrols might be circling the ravine, but someone would eventually remember the barn. They had to leave. He wrapped Ruth's arms around his shoulders, lifting her as gently as he could, while Isaiah took the baby. The boy held the child awkwardly, like something both sacred and unfamiliar, but he didn't complain. They stepped out into the pale morning light, leaving the hollow space beneath the barn behind them, just another shadow in a world already full of them. The forest was quiet, the air thick with damp and memory. Every branch, every stretch of trail seemed to echo with Nayella's steps. Caleb didn't need the linen anymore. He knew which way to go. The symbols she'd traced had planted themselves into his bones. He could feel her guidance in the tilt of the trees, the way moss grew on the north side of certain stones, the places where the underbrush had been pushed aside days or just hours before. The journey was slow. Twice they had to stop so Ruth could breathe, her face, pale lips chapped. Once they hid for nearly an hour while two men passed nearby, shouting about something stolen from the Carrington place. But each time fear began to rise, Caleb would touch the folded piece of linen in his pocket and remember the look in Nyela's eyes, the kind that made you believe in something greater than escape. By mid-afternoon, they reached the creek bend. It didn't look like much, just a slow curve of muddy water and a crooked tree leaning over the bank. But Nyela had described it exactly. The broken willow, its limbs dangling like open arms, and beneath it, half buried in silt, a circle of smooth stones laid in the shape of a crescent moon. Isaiah stepped forward, first placing the baby gently into Ruth's arms as she lay back against the base of the tree. Then he crouched and placed his palm against one of the stones. "I think she made it," he whispered. "I think she was here." Caleb didn't answer. He knelt beside Ruth, checking her pulse, brushing her damp hair away from her face. She was asleep or near it, but her breathing was even. The baby stirred, then let out a soft mewing cry. Caleb smiled for the first time in what felt like days. A noise broke the quiet. A twig snapped nearby, deliberate, not careless. Caleb's hand went to the shovel still slung over his back, his body rising to shield the others. Isaiah stood beside him, fists clenched, ready to fight, even with nothing but bare hands. But what stepped from the trees was no threat. A man, white-haired and cloaked in an old wool coat, raised his hand slowly. His voice was steady, soft. "You're safe now," he said. "We've been waiting." Behind him, a woman appeared, holding a flask of water and a bundle of clean linen. And further down the trail, more figures emerged, black, white, old, young, all bearing the quiet urgency of people who had done this many times before. The man stepped forward, his eyes falling on Ruth and the baby, then on the folded linen in Caleb's hand. He reached out, touching it gently. "I've seen this before," he murmured. "Your map, it's not the only one. There are more farther north." "But this was hers, wasn't it?" Caleb nodded. "Nyela." The man closed his eyes as if that name meant something he hadn't heard in years. Then he looked to the sky and whispered, not to anyone in particular. "She's still leading them." And though no one said it aloud, they all felt it. Nyela was gone, but the path was still open. The creek became their border between what had been and what could still be. For 3 days they remained hidden in the dense woods beyond its bend, nestled among people who never asked questions louder than a whisper. They brought warm broth, washed wounds, passed down blankets, stitched from old clothes and prayer. Ruth recovered slowly, the color returning to her cheeks, as her baby grew stronger in her arms, wrapped tight in soft cotton and silence. No one dared speak of returning, not to the barn, not to the fields, not to the world where names were barked and days measured in lashes. Caleb stayed close to the boy Isaiah, watching how he held the child like it was more than blood, like it was a promise. Every night he would walk the outer trail, circling the camp's edge like a sentry, listening for dogs, for horses, for the sound of boots on broken leaves. But none came, only wind and sometimes rain. It was during one of these walks that he found it, a piece of bark pinned under a smooth, flat stone. At first he thought it was just debris washed down from upstream, but when he picked it up, the marking stopped him cold. 3 lines, 1 curve, a mark shaped like a fishhook. It meant something. He didn't know how he knew, but he did. It was one of hers. Caleb showed it to the white-haired man who had first welcomed them. The man studied it without touching, then nodded solemnly. "She's still walking," he said, "still marking the way." "How can that be?" Isaiah asked from behind him. She fell, back at the ravine. There's no way." But the man didn't answer directly. Instead, he led them deeper into the woods, down a trail overgrown with moss and vines, until they reached a hollow tree, its trunk split wide like a wound. Inside, etched into the bark, were dozens of symbols. Some matched what was on the linen Caleb still carried. Others were new. "They call it the silent scripture," the man explained. "They don't travel with Bibles anymore. Just this. Symbols passed along, hidden in plain sight. Trees, stones, fence posts. We teach it to those who are willing to learn. Those who remember who started it." Caleb asked, though he already knew. "You're Nayella," the man said softly, her and her mother before her. Later that evening, Caleb sat beside Ruth and told her what they had found. She listened with tired eyes, her baby curled against her chest, and nodded slowly. "She didn't run for herself," she whispered. "She ran for all of us." In the days that followed, word spread quietly, carefully from one safe house to another. There were symbols now leading all the way to Pennsylvania. Someone had marked trees across 3 states, carving in the dark, sometimes with nails, sometimes with glass, always with the same hand, or perhaps with many hands guided by the same memory. Isaiah asked to learn it, the symbols, not just to read but to carve, and so he did. He practiced each one until they became part of his fingers, part of his rhythm. He etched his first set beneath the floorboards of the cabin. They'd been given a tiny set of instructions, carved for the next traveler who might come through. One night he returned from patrol with his shirt torn and his palms bleeding. Caleb asked what happened. "Nothing," he said, "just added a mark." And so it continued. Others picked up where Nayella left off, though no one saw her again. Rumors flickered in the corners of stories. A woman in a gray dress spotted near the Blue Ridge Mountains, silent as shadow. A stranger who led 3 children across a flooded pass without ever speaking a word. None of it confirmed. All of it sacred. The man with the white hair gathered each story like scripture, writing nothing down, only remembering. He told the children, "What matters isn't whether she's alive. What matters is that her path still is." And one morning, as the mist clung low to the fields, Ruth walked outside with her child. The boy was walking now, unsteady but brave. He toddled toward the split tree where the first message had been found and pressed his tiny palm to one of the carvings. The mark fit his hand perfectly, and Ruth smiled, not the smile of someone who had survived, but of someone who understood what survival could become. Nayella might have disappeared into the forest that night, swallowed by darkness and sacrifice. But her trail, her Bible without words, was now carried by feet that had never even seen the field she fled from. And in that way, she had never stopped walking. Years passed, not in the swift, sharp rhythm of seasons changing, but in the slow unfolding of lives, learning how to be whole again. The war came and went, its thunder distant from the safe houses tucked deep in forests, but its consequences sweeping through even the quietest corners. Slavery, at least on paper, had ended. The chains had been broken, the fields abandoned, the laws rewritten. But those who had once been owned knew better than to believe that paper could erase memory. Freedom was a language still being learned, hesitant, fragile, often spoken in code. By then, the silent scripture had become something more than survival. It was a lifeline, a legend, and for some, a kind of religion. In Pennsylvania, tucked behind a small stone church bordered by wild lavender and pine, there stood a structure that looked like a shed from the outside. But inside, the walls were lined with wood salvaged from barns, fences, even slave cabins long since crumbled. Each plank was carved not with names but with the symbols, the curves and lines, the crosses and hooks. A forest of markings, some deep, others fading, but all telling stories the world had nearly erased. They called it the Wall of the Unspoken. No one preached there. No one sang. Visitors arrived in silence, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, stepping into the room as if into a sanctuary. They would run their hands over the carvings, tracing the marks left behind by those who had walked before them. And every so often, someone would add a new one. A crescent for a child born free, a spiral for a family reunited, a mark shaped like a rising sun for those who had not made it but whose memory carried others forward. Caleb was an old man by the time he first visited. His beard had gone silver and his knees ached with the cold, but his eyes still held the fire of that muddy night under the Cooper barn. Isaiah pushed his wheelchair across the gravel path, now a tall man with lines etched into his face like map routes of a life hard lived. Ruth, slower now but still sharp, walked beside them, her hand resting on her son's shoulder. The boy, no longer a boy, carried with him a small wooden box. Inside was a piece of cloth, aged and fragile, the linen Nayella had once given them. They placed it beneath a pane of glass alongside a simple plaque. "She walked so we could remember." For a long time they stood there saying nothing. There was nothing to add, no tribute grand enough to match what she had done. But in the quiet, something stirred, something sacred. It wasn't a voice or a song, but it was real. The knowledge that her journey had not ended in that ravine. that her footsteps had become seeds. Outside, young people gathered around, a woman with thick braids and a soft voice. She was teaching them the symbols not from books, but by drawing in dirt, carving on bark, speaking with reverence. She told them stories too, not of battles or generals, but of women with no names who carved maps into silence and trusted that someone someday would know how to follow. A little girl raised her hand and asked, "Was Nayela real?" The woman paused, smiled, and looked toward the shed. "She's as real as the wind in the trees," she said. "And as long as we remember the path, she's never far." That evening, as the sky dimmed and the stars began their slow climb, Isaiah stood alone at the edge of the field. He held a carving tool in one hand, and with the other he traced the shape of a new symbol onto the last open space on the wall. It was a hand open and reaching forward, not upward, but outward. For those still walking, he stepped back and let the shadows take it. Somewhere far from the church, in a forest where moss clung to every stone and silence ruled the air, a traveler stumbled upon an old trail. They paused, noticing a strange mark etched into the side of a tree. It wasn't in any book. It wasn't a word, but it felt like direction. They touched it, heart pounding, and smiled. The Bible didn't need words. It only needed someone willing to walk it. If this story moved you even just a little, please take a moment to like, share, or leave a comment below. Your voice helps keep stories like Nayela's alive. Thank you for walking this path with us. We'll see you in the next story.